It's Not Your Fault is a podcast for parents, caregivers, and young people navigating the world and its challenges. Here's your host, Brandon Jones.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to another installment of It Is Not Your Fault, a teen mental health podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Jones, and on today's episode, we are talking about Black youth suicide prevention and the current issue that we're seeing in this particular community around the issue that is very hard and difficult to talk about, which is suicide. Recently, SAMSA, which is an organization, it's a federal organization for folks who don't know, and SAMSA is an acronym that stands for Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. This is like the federal department that focuses on all things chemical dependency and addiction and mental health, and they put out all different types of reports, information. They also put out a lot of different funding to have programs that service various different communities around the United States to make sure we're addressing the issues that are important in our community, to make sure that everybody has a healthy opportunity to live their life. And they came out with a briefing recently on Black youth suicide. And as a Black man myself, as someone who's participated in various different initiatives around suicide prevention, I found that this study was interesting and that I probably should bring it to you all here on the podcast, because I know a lot of these briefings and studies, they don't always make it to, everyone's coffee table or dinner table or even on your phone. They don't always scroll. You don't scroll past these types of posts often, but there's usually important information in these things. So I like to bring these things to the podcast so we can create a dialogue and some awareness around such important topics. Now, you may be thinking, what does race or ethnicity have to do with suicide? Why are we even breaking it down, talking about Black youth and suicide? And the reason for this is when you look at the statistics, we've seen a stark increase with this particular racial group, Black folks, of African Americans, folks who have slavery in their lineage. And we've seen a huge increase over the last, 6 years when it comes to suicidal ideation and actual suicide attempts. So again, not an easy topic to talk about, but there is something taking place within this community that we haven't seen before. And this briefing attempts to aim at figuring out what that is and what's happening. So let me go over some of the key points from the briefing, and then I'll talk about some of the strategies and what we can do to combat this issue within our community. Even if you're not African American, if you're not classified as Black, this is still an issue that's important to you because this affects all youth. Think about if you have children or grandchildren, or maybe you work with young people and you're connected to them. Maybe you're an aunt, uncle, or some sort of other family member. There are young people when a suicide attempt or an actual completed suicide takes place, a lot of people are affected, not just the person who takes their life, their families, their friends. Even if you didn't know the person well, it still hits home. It's a very important issue for us to understand and to figure out how do we support people if they do get to this space in life and they want to take their own life. So, and we're talking about young people, by the way, as well. So, suicide rates and risk factors was a key point that was highlighted in this briefing. Number one, suicide is the leading cause of death for youth ages 10 through 24. That's across ethnic lines. Black youth have seen nearly a 37% increase in suicide rates from 2018 to 2021. So again, that's pre-pandemic going into pretty much the first year of the pandemic. There's been a 37% increase in suicide rates. Now, a lot of people aren't the best at math, right? A lot of people look at 37% and say, what does that mean? Is that a lot? Is that a little bit? That is a lot. That is a lot. It's not quite 50%, which means that it almost doubled. But it is at a rate that is pretty alarming and raises some eyebrows to what is happening within this particular community where young Black people are seeking suicide as an option for them. Also, they're able to link specific things, risk factors as they call them, that are connected to suicide. Those risk factors were poverty, systematic racism, mental health stigma, and limited access to cultural competent care. And I'm going to swing back on that one because That's one that I hear a lot, and that a lot of the focus and attention is put in one space, but I think we should put in another. This is just a Brandon soapbox thing that I'm going to come back to in a moment before I close out. What they found were some unique challenges. One was intersectionality. Now, that's an academic term. Some of you may have heard it before. It's become more and more popular over the last few years. Intersectionality is ultimately just saying the overlapping of identities. So, for example, let's say you are a bisexual African American woman with a physical disability. That is intersectionality. All those different identities and elements of yourself cross over and they contribute to the outcomes within your life. That's what's called intersectionality. So they found that to be a unique challenge in how that impacts mental health, because for some people, some identities lead stronger than others, but they all may be impacted. So sometimes when people come into care, or sometimes when young people are trying to figure out their lives, it's hard to tell, okay, which are we addressing? Are we addressing the African American factor? Are we addressing the bisexual factor? Are we addressing the physical ability status factor? Like, what are we addressing the female or woman factor for this person? What are we actually addressing? That's one of the things that is looked at when we talk about intersectionality. The other two things that they found was discrimination and police violence contributes to trauma, depression, and suicidal ideation. Now, given the sense of where a lot of this research was taking place, you have to factor in the ramifications of George Floyd and all the other things that are taking place. So I'm not surprised to see that as one of the unique challenges that was featured in this report. And then the third thing that was featured as a unique challenge was Black LGBTQ plus youth face compounded stigma and lower access to professional care. Now, this is kind of an extension off the intersectionality piece. They teased it out to make a point that this specific group of young people who have sexual orientation and gender expressions that are not heterosexual have compound stigma and low access to professional care. Now, a lot of that is due to finding safe spaces to receive that care. It's not just because people are literally trying to cause harm or don't want to serve. It's because there's a lack of information and there is a lot of growth and understanding that needs to happen in these spaces to make sure that those young people get the adequate care that they need. And we have to be honest, in this work, like many other fields, we are just now getting into a space of being comfortable with different gender expressions, sexual orientations, even race to a certain extent. We are at a change in our society where we are addressing these issues differently than we ever have. So finding comfortable or safe enough spaces for those folks to go to is something that is a challenge at this point in time. They also found some structural barriers. The first structural barrier is a lack of Black mental health providers. In the United States, there's only 5.7% of the clinicians in the U.S. are classified as Black. Like, that's not a lot. Most of those are women. So if you're looking for a male therapist, it's even worse. If you're looking for an LGBTQIA plus therapist, is even lower than that. So there are challenges in this space of finding representation. And some people blame it on the system. I'm not one of those people. There's just not a lot of people going into counseling. There's not a lot of Black people going into counseling. And a lot of that, honestly, is culturally. It's not just because of racism. No one's stopping Black people from going to get master's degrees to become therapists. It's not happening. Like, they actually, you're welcome. I mean, you almost get a free degree if you really want to become a therapist, because they're needed. We're needed so bad. And I also mentioned, as someone who doesn't practice clinically anymore, this is one of my soft spots, and I help a lot of people, not just Black folks, but I help a lot of people come into this profession. I teach, I coach, I train, I meet with young people, talk them through the ropes, give them the ins and the outs. So if they really want to do this, this is what it looks like. I talk to people in the profession, making sure they don't leave, because I was that person. As a Black male therapist, I was a unicorn, and to a certain extent, I still am a unicorn. And there's not a lot of us, so I know how important it is to make sure we do have folks in those spaces to help, not just help the clients, but also help the field become more diverse and inclusive. But at 5.7%, that's not a huge rate. We got a lot of work to do in this space. Other structural barriers. There's a generational distrust in the healthcare due to historical mistreatment. So you may have heard of the term medical apartheid. I have not covered that on the podcast here, but I am very familiar with it, where there's a huge distrust in medical systems with folks of color, especially Black folks, where we've been mistreated. The most notable things, the Tuskegee experiment, but there have been so many other things that have impacted our community from a medical standpoint. There's a lot of mistrust towards healthcare systems. And we're not the only ethnic group that has that, but it is one that is pretty important. Another structural barrier, and this is one that I talk about a lot because we like to lean on the racism piece, which is important, and I'm not, belittling that, but it's more than just that. The next thing that this report found, and this is what I think is actually the number one thing, is the economic and systematic inequalities of effective healthcare use. The stuff is expensive. Therapy is not cheap, and getting access for suicidal ideation is difficult. And culturally, it's hard to talk about suicide as a Black person. Something we just don't do well until it's too late and someone makes an attempt or completes an attempt. And it's just, culturally and economically, I think are the two biggest barriers to preventing suicide and our mental health stigma. I don't think it's racism. Personally, I think racism has played a role, but we can't say that that's the issue today. We have so many tools at our dispense that it's hard to make that claim 100%. So we have some structural barriers: economics, a historical distrust, and the lack of providers. Now, let's talk a little bit. Well, let me go back because I mentioned specific risk factors in having culturally competent care. That's kind of what I was going to talk about. But let me drive this point home here before we close out the podcast. It's very hard to go into a situation and try to express how you feel when the other side doesn't understand your background or doesn't understand what you mean, or even sometimes doesn't understand your language. And that's important. So one of the things that I've dedicated my career, this stage that I am in my career, because I don't practice clinically anymore, is making sure that we have effective counselors and what I call providers out there. And that I try to make sure that people are as culturally competent, quote unquote, or the term I like to use is culturally intelligent to do this work. So no matter who walks through your door, what their ethnic background is, you can serve them effectively. You don't need to know everything about somebody's background. You don't need to be competent about somebody's ethnicity or race to serve them effectively. You need to be competent in your skill set and your ability to be a human and connecting with people and help them work through whatever issue they may have. Now, that's a huge mindset shift for a lot of people, and it takes a lot of work, and you have to be deliberate. But I truly believe that no matter what you look like, you can serve somebody therapeutically in who you are. And this is important for parents to know, because I meet so many parents that say, I want a Black male therapist. And then I'll pass on some names of some folks that I know. And then they say, hey, Brandon, I can't get in with this person. They're too busy. Do you have anyone else? I have a ton of white folks. I have some Asian folks. I even have some Somali folks. Do you want to try them? And a lot of the parents say no. And I say, hey, where your child is, you need to take a risk and stop leaning just on ethnicity and race and get your kids some help today. And that's my soapbox, is that we have to get kids help today. Suicide prevention is about taking action today, listening to the young people that are in your life, and being able to show up for folks so they don't feel isolated and alone. And also taking it serious. I mean, a lot of folks who don't take it serious enough when they see the signs that the young person in their life is suicidal. So a couple of things I want to mention that the briefing mentioned as far as strategies and interventions. One, community and family supports, encouraging open dialogue about mental health. I talk about that all the time. Hopefully this podcast has inspired you to do the same. School-based interventions. This is where I put a lot of my political and structural work, is around building school-based solutions. Schools are so important when it comes to the mental health of our children because our kids are in school most of the time throughout the year. And then faith-based programs are important as well. If that's something that is important to you as a family, don't be afraid to lean into the faith-based programming that you may have. Other prevention strategies that are mentioned are trainings for healthcare and community leaders that are culturally responsive and intelligent, state programs promoting equity, and then also federal strategies from folks like SAMSA that use frameworks and funding for mental health equity. We can do this work. We can't prevent young people from getting to this space. They may get there, but we have to show up for them, and we have to let them know that we care about them and we want them to be healthy and alive. So that's my message for today. I want to invite you all to keep on with this conversation. I'll talk more about this as we go. If you want to see this report, I'm going to post it in our Facebook group. That's one of the first places you can check us out. Just go to Facebook. You can search It Is Not Your Fault podcast. You can find us there. You'll find this actual briefing and some of my thoughts around this, as well as other podcasts there. Don't be afraid to reach out to us if you have any questions. It's Not Your Fault podcast on Facebook. Also, if you have any questions for me directly, feel free to go to my website, www.jegna.org. That's jegna.org. And if you found this podcast to be helpful, you'll find other podcasts that we do to also be helpful. Check us out at the podcast network, ShalettaMakesMeLaugh.com. That's ShalettaMakesMeLaugh.com, where you'll find myself and a plethora of amazing podcasters with great quality work. And lastly, I want to say, be safe, be constructive, and be well. And if anyone has any thoughts this year about suicide or suicidal ideation, please take it serious and seek out or get help that you need today. Don't wait till tomorrow. Take care, everybody.
To check out previous episodes of It's Not Your Fault, or to learn more about Brandon Jones, log on to ShalettaMakesMeLaugh.com.
You know Shaletta makes you laugh, but did you know Shaletta Brundage can also make you think and boost your business? Media personality, activist, and comedian Shaletta Brundage founded Shaletta Makes Me Laugh to celebrate and share the best of Black culture. It's a podcasting platform. You can download 10 weekly podcasts hosted by African-American subject experts at ShalettaMakesMeLaugh.com or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. ShalettaMakesMeLaugh.com is also a production house, creating broadcast-quality commercial content. And Shaletta and her team of storytellers create powerful promotional campaigns to get businesses the brand awareness they're looking for. Some of Minnesota's top businesses trust Shaletta, and you can too. Get out the word about your events and products and get in front of communities of color with ShalettaMakesMeLaugh.com. She's got the power to help your business.